So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. I actually saw a very early version of this two or three years ago, I think. So I kind of, some of my discussion is trying to compare what I saw before and what I'm seeing now. And one of my first comments is that in this new version, they tried to do the spin with communication, which I thought it was pretty cool. And seeing the presentation right now, I think you guys need to first focus much more on the communication part, because that's the new thing that you are all introducing. So let's talk a little bit about the paper. So in the paper, they assess whether household expectations are consistent with some macroeconomic concepts. They first look at an income Fisher equation, and they look at a Phillips curve, and they also look at a Taylor rule. They then evaluate if households are consistent with these expectations, and if consistent with these macroeconomic concepts, and if consistency actually improves accuracy. And then the last thing that they look at is to evaluate if consistency is also changing or being affected by central bank communication. In terms of how they do this, to assess consistency, they calculate shares of households that respond in accordance to different concepts. So they're just pretty much summing how many consumers or households are responding in accordance with a Fisher equation or a Taylor rule or a Phillips curves over the share of overall households in the sample. To evaluate forecast accuracy, they're comparing forecast errors from households to professional forecasters. And to evaluate the impact of communication, they're looking at three types of channels. The first one is a standard channel. It's a central bank communication, so they're going to have some dummy variables for different types of central bank communication milestones, and look at how these dummy variables are going to be affecting the consistency among households. They're going to be looking at a transmission channel, which looks at volume of news about inflation, unemployment, and policy rates. And they also look at a receiver channel, which is basically the answer to some of the questions in the Michigan survey about how households perceive news. In terms of the results, they find that some households are consistent with these economic concepts, more or less on average. We see more households being consistent with the Fisher equation and the Taylor rule, and some households also being consistent or responding in accordance with Phillips curve. They find that consistency improves accuracy. So among the households that are consistent, they're responding consistent with these three concepts. They're becoming more accurate as well. They find that consistency improves with central bank communication and the volume of news. And they also find that, I don't think I had time to go over this by the end, but they also find that consistency among households declines with negative perception of inflation, unemployment, and credit conditions. So there is a lot going on in the paper right now. And because I have, I don't even know, 10 minutes or so, I'm only going to max. I'm only going to focus on some things, and I left a final slide that I'm not going to show you, but I'll give it to him, so with extra comments, just to help a little bit on the paper. So I like the use of the equations for the Fisher equation. I thought they were creative, and the questions are nice, and you can actually test for this for awareness of nominal versus real concepts. So I'm not going to talk about this now. I like the results of the Taylor rule pretty much because they agree with the paper that I had with my co-author, so I'm happy, and also it makes my job easier. I had a hard time with the Phillips curve, and I also had a hard time with the Phillips curve in the first version of the paper, so this is still going on, at least for me. I think the comparison with the professionals, if I understand what is in the paper, is not done exactly in the way that it should, or I would call it a little bit unfair, but I'll go into that in a few seconds. I had some issues with the communication analysis, but those are not too big, and some issues with the robustness and some minor comments that I'm not going to get into here, but they are in my last slide. Okay, so Phillips curve, when Carlos and I started working on the Taylor rule project, we thought about the Phillips curve, but we always had this issue with the Phillips curve because of supply shocks, and not necessarily the Phillips curve holds or the negative relation between unemployment and inflation would hold because you had supply shocks. And in the new version of the paper, I think they addressed it very nicely. They're very open about it, and they go over and try to find dates in which supply shocks are more predominant, and try to address this issue in a very open way. So I think in the way that it's set up right now, I think I'm happy about it, but I still had some few questions that I wanted to ask. In the paper, they're talking about a Phillips curve as a short-run trade-off, right? But the questions are about 12 months. So how should I think about 12 months as the relevant short run? And I understand there is very little that you guys can do about it because that's how the question has been posed. But I think it would be nice to have some comments at least about this in the paper. Also, in periods of when supply shocks are more predominant, and so what should I expect about consistency? So how would I think about if households are not responding in accordance or responding in accordance with a Phillips curve? Is this because they are understanding supply shocks, or what is behind this? So would I expect to see more consistency or less consistency? I wasn't sure what to expect when in cases in which supply shock or in periods in which supply shocks are more predominant. And I think in the end, the pointer is the thing in the middle. Mm-hmm. So in the end, I think we end up seeing that you have some cases in which So the other thing that they do, and I think it's a fair thing to look at, is to consider periods in which the Phillips curve holds versus periods in which the Phillips curve doesn't hold in the data. And then look at what happens to consistency across households over time. And I think the shaded areas here are periods in which the Phillips curve holds, and the non-shaded are periods in which the Phillips curve doesn't hold. And I think the results are kind of all over the place, right? Here you see consistency increasing, but the Phillips curve doesn't hold. And here the Phillips curve doesn't hold, but consistency is declining. So I kind of had a hard time understanding what's going on here and how to think through these charts. Also, they're way too shaded. So maybe you want to shade the periods in which the Phillips curve doesn't hold. It'll make the visualization a little bit better. And another thing that you could do is to try to look at the data and look at frequencies across. Look at the time sample for the data and count how many periods, or I think months is what you're using, how frequently the Phillips curve is holding in the data, and compare that to what you see from the households. Maybe that's another way of looking and trying to assess if households are responding in accordance with the patterns that you're seeing in the data. But that's a different suggestion. All right. So the comparison to professionals. The SPF is a much better data in some sense than the Michigan survey because they asked about levels and not only categorical variables as most of the questions that are being used from the Michigan survey. Because they ask about levels, I think to compare, the main objective of the paper is to look at households, right? So I think the comparison has to be in a fair way. So the way Carlos and I approached this in our paper was to look at the SPF data, categorize the data, make it 1, 0, and -1, up, down, the same, and then compare to the Michigan survey. So we're trying to transform the SPF data to make it comparable to the Michigan survey. And we also looked at, it's of course interesting to look at what is happening at levels with the SPF, but given that the main focus is on consumers here, we want to make it as comparable as possible. And I think it's the same comment that I would have on the treatment of the data. So if you want to compare to realized data, you have to make it similar to what you see in the Michigan survey. And I think you guys did this in some parts of the paper and some others you didn't, and I wasn't sure. It wasn't clear for me when this was there and when it wasn't. So I would suggest categorizing the SPF data. The accuracy results, you are comparing consistent households with an average of the SPF, I think. So I think it would be interesting to also look at what a comparison between consistent households and consistent professionals. And we know that you even said during the presentation that not all professionals are consistent with the macroeconomic concepts that you're interested in. And I'm gonna come back to the zero lower bound point in a minute, but you want to also drop the zero lower bound period for the SPF, and for the only reason is because you have to drop it for the Michigan survey, and I'll come back to this in a second. Okay, in terms of communications, the communication analysis, from what I understood in the paper, the dummy variables for communication attain a value of 1 from the period that the communication method was introduced to the end of the sample. And I think this is kind of problematic because some of these communication methods were on and off. So for example, if you think about the forward guidance during 2003-4, it didn't last all the way to 2015 or whatever your end of sample is. So I would suggest having ones and zeros when the communication strategy is being used. It's a monthly data, right, for the Michigan survey. So you can literally have the press conference with ones in dates in which the press conference is being done, and not in the other ones. So I'm not sure if this is going to change your results, but I think this is a better way to approach it. It made me think about some lagged effects. Maybe there is some learning in the communication strategy. So maybe if the Fed is communicating and households take some time to understand. So I would test for some lagged effects of the communication. And you talk about news as well. I think throughout the financial crisis, we saw so much news about everything from the economy. So maybe there is something special with the effects of communication during the financial crisis. And I don't understand why in Table 9, this is kind of specific, but in Table 9 he's putting together the two measures of communication, the sender effect, the central bank communication, and the perception from households, but he doesn't include the media. They don't include the media measure, so I don't understand why. I think it would be interesting to look at the net effects from each of the three types of communication that they are looking into. And just a little bit on Table 9, here they are trying to assess how news perception, these are perception from the households, are affecting their knowledge, let's call it, of the Phillips curve, Taylor rule, and the Fisher equation. And it's interesting that kind of bad news tend to have more effects or be more significant than good news. It made me think about one of the, for those who worked with the Michigan survey before, you probably have noticed that households are kind of biased in their answers. They tend to be, I'm going to call them pessimistic, but it's not really the technical word for this, but they tend to answer more frequently that interest rates are going to go up, inflation is going to increase, and unemployment is going to increase. So it made me think about if maybe there is something mechanical going on here. And this was something that Carlos and I struggled a lot when using the Michigan survey data and not trying to be unfair in any way and getting to results that were basically being driven by the pattern of answers that they have. So I think you guys have to think a little bit about this pessimism and if there's something there that is just coming from the type of answers and the pattern of answers from the households. The zero lower bound, very quickly, The question in the Michigan survey is about borrowing rates. And when you apply it to the Taylor rule, you have to be careful because borrowing rates during the zero lower bound were not even highly correlated with the policy rate, especially during the beginning of the zero lower bound. They acknowledge that and they treat that very well, but they get into the robustness and keep reporting what happens to consistency with the Taylor rule during the zero lower bound. And I wouldn't even report that, but given that you did, you kind of need to give an explanation. Why do you think consistency with the Taylor rule is increasing during that period? And I thought it was, I wouldn't touch on this result, but given, if you want to choose to show it, you better explain what's going on. So it's a very nice paper. I really like the refocusing. I think the communication strategy and the effects of communication on our awareness is a super important topic. And I thought it was a creative use of the survey questions. And I have a whole bunch of comments and minor stuff that you should take a look at afterwards. Thank you.